13 minutes after 7. Thank you so much for staying with us here on Nationwide at 5. We are taking your calls, 630-937-124, 618-8255. But just before we go to the phone lines, I do want to hear more about the quote, because I've heard the quote before, obviously. And as I was saying to Miss Dixon, my generation, the millennials, and certainly Gen Z, when they hear of FINSAC, a lot of times the question is, why should we care? And I understand the government to be saying these archives will assist in the understanding of that period and what it cost the country. But we're not a reading people. So the idea that most people will sit and go through, I've started to go through the documents, it's unlikely to happen. So let me go back to the quote from Ronald Thwaites. You were attempting to explain the context in which that quote was made. Let me hear that.
First of all, I know the quote very well because Thwaites said that quote in an interview with me. Yes, it was in an interview with me he made that quote. And that quote was a criticism of the sustained high interest rate policy that was going on at the time under the Patterson administration, of which Omar Davis was the finance minister. Later, after the financial meltdown, the sustained high interest rate policy, and you would have heard this, was identified as the basis of the collapse of several of the institutions, because what happened, you borrow money at, let us say, 10%, and you collateralize it at that interest rate. The government of the day jacked up interest rate to, it went as far as 100%, all in an effort to mop up the supply of money, liquidity in the economy, because it was felt, the theory was that if you reduce the supply of money in the economy, then you would be able to bring down inflation, because people would not have money
to spend as much,
to spend and to buy scarce foreign exchange. That was a theory. It was meant to be an initial shock to the system, that is, high interest rates. However, it just went on for too long. And viable businesses, viable loans just became unsustainable.
Pause. Because I've questioned, because I've seen that in the literature, and I've questioned, certainly there must have been voices at the time who were urging the minister to bring that policy to an end.
Yes.
Why didn't he follow it? Your best recollection. Those calls. Why didn't he heed those calls?
Looking back now, 2020 vision, I think at the time, as a country, as a media, as an academic community, those of us in politics as well, frankly, the level of financial literacy was wanting, was not strong enough. Cabinet ministers told me after that Omar Davis virtually terrorized cabinet members into thinking that this was the orthodoxy, this was how it ought to go, and he was not effectively challenged.
Being the PhD he is.
Being the PhD he is. Yes. And as a result, we pay a heavy price for a policy that had gone terribly wrong. There's also the issue, Ricardo, and some people don't want to hear that, but if we are going to be faithful, to the truth, some of these institutions were also being run by executives who were conflicted and in an environment where the financial regulatory system was weak. People were making, were doing financial engineering, yes, without what we now have as a solid regulatory framework
Right.
to guide what you could do or not do, what ratios you need to maintain in terms of ensuring the viability of a financial institution. That was absent. It was later, having had the meltdown and the experience,
put in place the
we put
safeguards.
those guardrails in.
What do you mean when you say they were conflicted?
They were conflicted. For example, you running a bank, you were the chairman, the executive chairman. You know what executive chairman
You have executive
mean?
power and you chair the board, right?
And exactly. And then you had the emergence of groups of companies. So you had a merchant bank, you have an insurance company, you have which other one? Merchant banks, insurance, you would have probably a securities dealership. Yes? So you had several finance-related entities of which you were
Involved.
an executive chairman or definitely involved at a very senior and influential level where you could impact decision-making.
The politics has always been competitive. So I imagine again at that time you'd have somebody like Edward Seaga as the opposition leader.
Yes.
Who I must imagine was part of the urging to be careful. Because he certainly had, well, he's credited as having good financial management skills and, financial management know-how. What was his role in terms of your recollection of him being in the parliament, standing up, I imagine, as we have the competitive politics that
First
must have
of all,
happened?
I recall two major interventions by Seaga. The first would have been about the PNP came back to power.
89?
February 89. Michael Manley came back to power, stressing continuity. He had had his road to Damascus conversion from democratic socialism to the market economy.
He was going to follow orthodoxy.
Yes. And at the time, the 1990s, there was this push to liberalize the Jamaican economy. And with that, liberalize the foreign exchange market. Because before that, we had controls on if you were to travel, how much you could buy in foreign exchange. All part of an effort to, one, stop the dollar from running, stop inflation, yes, and to mask what was the weak performance of the Jamaican economy. Yes? And when Michael decided to liberalize the foreign exchange market, there was a huge debate over the usefulness and whether that would be prudent. And
The liberalization
of the foreign exchange.
whether that would be prudent.
Yes. And he stuck with it. He was supported by some powerful, influential voices in the private sector, and equally those voices that disagreed. And he persisted. And I remember it was a parliamentary debate, budget debate, where Seaga said to Michael Manley, "Don't do it. Don't do it. We are not in a position, yes, to have a free market, liberalized foreign exchange system. Don't do it." And he went on, pressed on. By 1991, 92, yes, the thing blew up. Yes, the dollar started to fly. Yeah, and we were in problems. Inflation was going through the roof. The dollar was running. The costs of goods and services were going. Yeah, which, yeah, some say, I'm no economist, laid the basis for what took place later in the mid-1990s, with financial institutions going under.
Collapsing.
And then, on another occasion, this would have been about, you just asked me, so I'm just going from memory. Yeah, this would have been about 93 now. When did Omar Davis become finance minister? Omar Davis...
92 or 93, I believe.
No.
It was before that?
It was after that, I think.
Okay.
He entered the parliament in 94 in a by-election. I think 94 or 93.
Okay.
And Siaga, in another parliamentary sitting, I don't know if this was a budget debate, but in another parliamentary sitting, I remember reporting on it. Siaga stood up in Gordon House and said to the government, said to Omar Davis, that the financial sector was in trouble. Companies were on the edge, were on the brink. And Omar Davis, with his usual style, can be very arrogant, he was, accused Siaga as being unpatriotic, alarming, yes, meant to really discredit the country. When Siaga said that you need to help the financial institutions now because they were in trouble. Yeah, there was a mismatch of assets and liabilities, and he looked at Omar and said, you need to intervene now, and he was dismissed.
And yet, just before we go to the phone lines, and yet, that kind of financial management was rewarded at the polls. And I'm wondering now if a large part of that is what you conceded, that you all in media, senior ministers of the cabinet, other interests, didn't do a good enough job of explaining to the Jamaican people what was at stake.
I think so. Yeah. Because some of us didn't even understand what was happening. If one is to be truthful. Didn't even understand it. Yeah, we were catching up. Yeah. And Omar was this perceived as this intellectual giant. Yeah. And as I said, cabinet ministers told me, debate was virtually muted at cabinet until you know what hit the fan. Yeah.